In 1926, a team of archaeologists in Sweden began excavating beneath a medieval church on an island called Frösö. The name alone should have been a clue. Frösö, literally Freyr's Island, named after the Norse god of fertility and harvests. But the archaeologists weren't thinking about pagan gods. They expected routine Christian burials, maybe some Viking-era coins or pottery, standard stuff. What they found in that first pit changed everything we thought we knew about the conversion of Scandinavia, because beneath that church floor they discovered something that had been deliberately destroyed, carefully buried, hidden for nearly 1,000 years, and it wasn't alone. Since 1926, archaeologists have been finding the same thing beneath medieval churches across Scandinavia, the same patterns, the same evidence of destruction, the same strategic placement. For centuries, we only had Christian writers telling us what happened during the conversion. They wrote about burning temples and smashing idols, dramatic stories of pagan resistance crushed by Christian kings, but historians weren't sure how much to believe. Were these accounts exaggerated? Propaganda to make the church look powerful? Then we started digging, and the ground told a different story. Today, I'm going to show you exactly what archaeologists found beneath those churches, and why Christians were so obsessed with building on those specific spots. By the end, you'll understand that the conversion of Scandinavia wasn't about changing hearts and minds. It was about erasing an entire religion from the landscape itself. Let's start with what they found at Frösö, because once you see it, everything else makes sense. Part 1. Understanding what was lost. But before I show you what archaeologists discovered, you need to understand what Vikings were actually doing at these sites. Because when you hear Viking sacrifice, you probably picture something barbaric, primitive, maybe a lone priest cutting an animal's throat while chanting to unseen gods. That's not what this was. Norse sacrifice was the glue that held their entire society together. It was politics, religion, and community, all wrapped into one ceremony. Here's how it actually worked. Several times a year, tied to the agricultural calendar, entire communities would gather at sacred sites. Sometimes these were elaborate timber halls. Sometimes sacred groves, sometimes just natural features like springs or massive old trees. People brought animals. Horses were the most prestigious offering, expensive, powerful, associated with the gods themselves. But also cattle, pigs, goats. The local chieftain or leader would perform the sacrifice. He'd cut the animal's throat, collect the blood in special wooden bowls. Then came the crucial part. The blood would be sprinkled on the altar, on the temple walls, on the participants themselves. You'd have blood on your face, your hands, your clothes. This wasn't grotesque to them. This was sacred. The blood carried divine power. It connected you to the gods, to your community, to the land itself. After the ritual, they'd butcher the animal and cook it. Then everyone would feast together. Everyone ate from the same sacrifice. Everyone drank all that had been blessed by contact with the sacred. This wasn't just a meal, it was communion. You were sharing food with the gods and binding yourself to every person there. These ceremonies marked the seasons. They ensured good harvests. They sealed alliances. They settled disputes. They reinforced who had power and who didn't. When Christian writers described these gatherings, they focused on the blood and the killing. They called it barbaric devil worship. But for Vikings, this was how you maintained cosmic order, how you kept your community together, how you connected the human world with the divine. Now, Adam of Bremen, a Christian writer around 1075, described the sacrifices at Uppsala, Sweden's most important temple. He claimed they sacrificed 9 males of every species, including humans, and hung the bodies in a sacred grove, every tree dripping with corpses. For centuries, historians thought he was lying, making up horror stories to justify the Christian conquest. Then, archaeologists started digging, and they found evidence that made Adam's accounts look less like fantasy and more like documentation. At Tisø in Denmark, they found a lake used for ritual deposits for centuries, hundreds of objects thrown in as offerings, and bones, massive quantities of animal bones. At Borg in Norway, they excavated the largest Viking chieftain's hall ever found, evidence of enormous feasts where dozens of animals were ritually slaughtered and consumed. But the most revealing discoveries came from beneath churches, because that's where Christians specifically targeted. Let me show you what they found. Part 2. Frösö, the sacred tree. So what did those archaeologists find beneath the church at Frösö in 1926? A pit filled with bones, but not human bones, animal bones, bears mostly, but also other species, all carefully arranged in patterns, mixed with the bones, layers of birch bark, charcoal, ash. And here's what made them realize this wasn't a random burial. Everything showed signs of deliberate burning, then careful placement. then burial. This wasn't garbage. This wasn't a cooking pit. This was the remains of something sacred. The archaeologists had found the destroyed remnants of a pagan sacrifice site, and when they dated the destruction, it matched exactly with when the church was built. The Christians hadn't just built here by accident. They'd deliberately chosen this spot, cut down something that had stood here, burned it, buried the remains, and then built their altar directly on top. What had they destroyed? A sacred tree. In Norse belief, trees held cosmic significance. The world tree, Yggdrasil, literally held up the universe in their mythology. Its roots reached into the underworld, its trunk supported the human world, its branches touched the heavens. At important cult sites across Scandinavia, specific trees became sacred. Ancient oaks, massive ash trees. They weren't just symbols. People believed these trees were dwelling places for divine power. At Frösö, this tree had been the center of worship for generations, probably centuries. People would hang offerings in its branches, sacrifice animals at its base, gather around it for ceremonies, connecting the community to Freyr, the god of fertility, prosperity, and the harvest cycle that kept everyone alive. Then Christians arrived on the island. They didn't negotiate with the tree's guardians. They didn't gradually convince people to stop worshipping there. They cut it down, chopped it into pieces, burned those pieces, collected the animal bones that had accumulated over generations of sacrifice, burned those too, then buried everything in a pit and built a church directly on top. The Christian altar sat precisely where the sacred tree had stood. This wasn't practical. Frösö is an island. There were plenty of other spots to build a church. Easier spots, flatter ground, better access. They chose this location for one reason: symbolic conquest. The message was unmistakable. Your sacred tree is dead. Your god Freyr couldn't protect it. Our God is stronger. Worship here belongs to Christ now. But here's what's really chilling. Frösö wasn't unique. This was the pattern. Part 3. Uppsala, the Golden Temple. If Frösö shows us local pagan practice being erased, Uppsala shows us what happened at the highest level of power. Uppsala was the religious and political center of Sweden. When Christian writers described it, they used words like magnificent and terrifying. Adam of Bremen claimed Uppsala had a massive temple containing golden statues of 3 gods, Thor in the center holding his hammer, Odin the war god on one side, Freyr the fertility god on the other. He described sacrifices happening every 9 years, with bodies hanging in the sacred grove nearby. Historians spent centuries debating whether any of this was real. No temple ruins were found. Maybe Adam invented the whole thing to make paganism look impressive and its destruction look more heroic. Then, modern excavations started revealing the truth. And it was more complex than anyone expected. Archaeologists found massive royal halls at Uppsala, dating back to the 5th to 7th centuries. These weren't just residences, they were ceremonial centers, places where political power and religious authority merged. They found evidence of processions, ritual deposits, post holes showing elaborate wooden structures. The site was absolutely central to Swedish royal power for centuries. They also found 3 enormous burial mounds, royal graves from the 6th century containing warriors buried with incredible wealth. Swords, armor, gold. These mounds dominated the landscape, visible for miles. They were statements carved into the earth itself. But Adam's Golden Temple? No physical evidence of that specific building. At least not yet. Here's what probably happened. Adam heard about Uppsala's importance, about the rituals and sacrifices that happened there, and he described it using imagery familiar to Christians. A temple like Solomon's temple in the Bible, decorated with gold and housing idol statues. The reality was likely different. Norse temples weren't always buildings. Sometimes the word meant sacred enclosures, or spaces within larger halls where rituals occurred. The sacrifices were real. The sacred status was real. The royal ceremonies were real. But the architecture might have been nothing like Adam imagined. What is absolutely clear, Uppsala was Scandinavia's most important pagan site, the symbolic heart of Norse royal religion. And when Christianity finally won in Sweden, they built a massive church there, not a modest country church, a statement building. Eventually it became an archbishop's seat, the religious capital of Christian Sweden. The old royal burial mounds were left standing, too massive to destroy, too politically dangerous to desecrate. But the church dominated the site now. The Christian god ruled where Norse gods had reigned. And here's something extraordinary archaeologists discovered recently: a processional avenue marked by huge wooden posts, dated to the late Iron Age. This was a ritual pathway, probably used for ceremonies approaching the sacred center of Uppsala. The posts were eventually pulled down and destroyed. Right around the time Christianity arrived, the pattern repeats. destroy the sacred markers, build your own in their place. But was this really a systematic strategy, or just coincidence at a few major sites? Let me show you just how widespread this was. Part 4. The pattern across Scandinavia. Once you know what to look for, you see it everywhere. At Mera in Norway, archaeologists found a pagan cult site with clear evidence of animal sacrifices and ritual feasting. An 11th century Christian church was built directly on top. Same location, deliberate replacement. At Jelling in Denmark, the royal center of Danish power, King Harald Bluetooth converted to Christianity around 965. What did he do immediately after? He built a church right next to the massive pagan burial mounds of his parents. Then he dug up his father's body from its pagan grave and reburied it inside the new church in a Christian burial. The message to his subjects: the old ways are finished, even the dead must convert. The new God rules everything now. At Borg in Lofoten, Norway, they excavated the largest Viking chieftain's hall ever found. A massive feasting hall where the local ruler hosted ritual meals with his followers. They found evidence of huge quantities of animals being slaughtered and consumed in ceremonies. When Christianity came to the region, the hall system collapsed. The rituals stopped. The building fell into decay. Eventually, a church was built nearby. At Ranheim in Norway, archaeologists in 2004 found a complete pagan cult site beneath a medieval church. Post holes showing a ritual structure, animal bones from sacrifices, evidence of ceremonial feasting that had gone on for generations. Then, right around Norway's conversion, someone deliberately demolished it, pulled up the posts, removed the artifacts, and built a Christian church directly on top. The same pattern, over and over. But here's what's fascinating. The evidence changes depending on when you're looking. Early conversion sites, like Frösö in the late 10th and early 11th centuries, show violent, dramatic destruction. Cut down trees, burned remains, physical erasure. Later sites show something different, gradual abandonment. The rituals just stop. Buildings decay. Nobody maintains them. Nature takes over. Why the difference? Because the Christian strategy evolved. Early on, newly converted kings needed to prove their power. Destroying pagan sites demonstrated that the old gods couldn't protect their own sacred spaces. It was psychological warfare, showing everyone that the Christian God was stronger. But once Christianity was established and the old religion had no organized resistance, you didn't need dramatic destruction anymore. You just stopped funding pagan sites, stopped allowing sacrifices, prohibited the festivals, and let time do the work. Within one generation, the sites were abandoned. Within 2 generations, nobody remembered exactly where the old altars had been. The knowledge died with the last practitioners. The landscape itself was Christianized. But there's one more question we need to address, the uncomfortable one. What about human sacrifice? Part 5. The human sacrifice question. Christian sources claimed Vikings regularly practiced human sacrifice. Adam of Bremen described bodies hanging in trees at Uppsala. Arab travelers wrote about slaves killed at Viking funerals. Church documents describe prisoners sacrificed to Odin before battles. For decades, historians assumed this was propaganda, Christians exaggerating pagan barbarism to justify conquest and forced conversion. Then we started finding bodies. At Trelleborg in Denmark, archaeologists discovered a mass grave, dozens of bodies, many showing signs of execution, decapitation, blunt force trauma to the skull, dated to the late Viking Age. Were they criminals executed under Viking law? War captives killed after a battle? Or sacrificial victims offered to the gods? The evidence can't tell us for certain. At Flakstad in Norway, they found a Viking Age burial containing a woman who'd been decapitated. Her head was placed in a specific position. The burial showed signs of ritual significance. And across Scandinavia, archaeologists keep finding human remains in wells, mixed with animal bones and valuable objects. The deposits look ritualistic. So what's the truth? The evidence suggests human sacrifice did happen. But probably not as regularly or dramatically as Christian sources claimed. More likely, occasional ritual killings at major events, funerals of important leaders, where slaves or captives might be killed to accompany the dead into the afterlife. Executions of criminals that took on ritual significance, killed not just as punishment, but as offerings. Possibly prisoners of war sacrificed, after major battles, offered to Odin, the war god, in thanks for victory. But the everyday sacrifices, the seasonal festivals that communities gathered for, the rituals that marked planting and harvest, those involved animals, not humans. Still, even the possibility of human sacrifice gave Christian kings powerful justification for their actions. They weren't destroying your religion, they were stopping murder. Whether or not that was their real motivation, it made excellent propaganda. Hard to defend your sacred traditions when Christians can point to human bones and say, "You're killing people for your gods." But this raises the final question. Why build churches specifically on pagan sites? Why not just destroy the old temples and build churches somewhere else? Part 6. Why churches on pagan sites? Christians had 3 reasons for building churches directly on top of pagan sacred sites. First, practical. These locations were already community gathering places. People knew where they were. Roads led to them. Social networks were built around them. If you built a church somewhere random, people might not come, but if you built it where they'd been gathering for generations, they'd continue showing up. Now for Christian services instead of pagan sacrifices, you weren't changing behavior patterns, just redirecting them. Second, psychological. If the old gods were real and powerful, they'd defend their sacred spaces, right? By building churches on pagan sites and nothing bad happening, no divine punishment, no supernatural revenge, Christians proved the old gods were powerless. Every year the church stood was more evidence that Thor and Odin couldn't or wouldn't protect their own altars. Third, spiritual conquest. In medieval Christian thinking, pagan sites weren't just wrong, they were occupied by demons. Building a church there wasn't just replacement, it was exorcism, spiritual warfare. You were claiming the land itself for Christ, driving out evil spirits, sanctifying ground that had been corrupted by devil worship. The strategy worked brilliantly. Within a few generations, people forgot the sites had ever been pagan. The churches became so strongly associated with Christianity that the pagan past was completely erased from memory. Except archaeology remembers. Beneath the church floors, the evidence remains. Conclusion: the ground doesn't lie. Beneath medieval churches across Scandinavia, archaeologists keep finding the same thing: evidence of a systematic campaign to physically erase Norse religion from the landscape. Destroyed sacred trees, demolished temple structures, burned ritual objects, all carefully buried before Christian churches were built directly on top. This wasn't a gentle process of changing minds through persuasive preaching. This was cultural replacement backed by royal power and strategic planning. The sacrifices at these sites weren't savage barbarism. They were sophisticated community rituals that maintained social bonds, marked the seasons, and connected people to forces they believed controlled their survival. When Christians stopped the sacrifices, they weren't just changing religious practices. They were dismantling the social structures that held communities together. That's why they built churches on these exact spots, not just to replace the buildings, but to replace their function. Christian Mass, Christian festivals, Christian community gatherings, all designed to fill the void left by pagan ceremonies. It worked. By 1200, Scandinavia was Christian. The sacrifices had stopped. The sacred groves were cut down. The temples were gone. The Norse gods fell silent. But beneath the churches, the evidence remains. Animal bones arranged in ritual patterns, post holes from sacred structures, ash from ceremonial fires, layers of birch bark carefully placed by hands that believed they were touching the divine. The Vikings' voices are silent. Their rituals are lost. Their gods are forgotten by most, but archaeology lets their world speak. And what it tells us is this: the conversion of Scandinavia wasn't a miracle of faith transforming willing hearts. It was a calculated campaign of cultural erasure, one church at a time, one sacred site at a time, one destroyed temple at a time, until nothing remained but the stones beneath the floor. If there's a particular aspect of this story you want me to explore, whether it's the people who resisted, the rebellions that were crushed, or something else entirely, let me know in the comments below. Because not everyone's story has been told yet, and I want to cover what matters most to you. Thanks for watching.